These are some of the roles in World War I that were even more dangerous than the already deadly experience of fighting in the frontline trenches. Each role was disturbing and dangerous in its own way, showing us the lengths to which people were willing to go to destroy each other. On the other hand, some sacrificed themselves doing the incredibly risky roles to help and save others. Number 1. Tunnelers. In World War I, the Western Front was not only a battleground on the surface, but also underground. Tunnelers, also known as sappers, were digging extensive networks of tunnels beneath no man's land. When it became clear that breaking through the front on the surface was impossible, both sides began digging towards each other under no man's land. The goal was to place and detonate enormous mines beneath enemy positions, which proved to be an extremely effective tactic, obliterating entire positions along with the soldiers in them. However, it soon became clear that tunneling beneath the battlefield in unstable ground was a very, very dangerous job. Sadly, many tunnelers remain buried deep beneath the former battlefields to this day, having died in some of the most horrific ways imaginable. The conditions for digging were demanding and extremely hazardous. In addition to the danger of tunnel collapses, which could bury tunnelers alive with no hope of rescue, there were many other dangers, often discovered only when it was too late for some. Tunnelers might encounter underground water, which could quickly fill the narrow tunnel, leaving no chance for escape. Toxic gases from the battlefield, from fired shells and ammunition, would seep into the tunnels and were often deadly for the tunnelers. To mitigate this risk, they always carried canaries in cages. The canary would show symptoms of poisoning first, signaling the tunnelers to evacuate immediately. Constantly standing in cold water, in darkness, with only a candle for light and primitive digging tools, they had to work in complete silence because both sides were intensely listening for them. If discovered, enemy tunnelers would start digging towards them, aiming to dig a tunnel beneath them, plant a mine, and detonate it, burying the live tunnelers and preventing further digging in the area. They were always on edge, rarely knowing if the enemy was aware of their presence until it was too late. Tunnelers would sometimes encounter the enemy underground, either accidentally or deliberately breaking into each other's tunnels. This led to horrific hand-to-hand combat in the dark, with miners using picks and shovels as weapons. Standard rifles and bayonets were useless in such tight spaces, and they even had shortened versions of standard rifles with cut-off stocks and shortened barrels to be used in the narrow tunnels. The conditions were extremely claustrophobic, and the thought of tunnel collapses and enemy mines was always in the back of their minds. As the war progressed, tunnels had to be dug deeper to avoid enemy detection, increasing the risks of collapses, drowning, and gas poisoning. One particularly tragic event occurred in 1917, when French artillery accurately struck the Winterberg tunnels, trapping 270 German soldiers inside. Additionally, if the enemy captured tunnel entrances or the surrounding territory, the miners would be isolated and often unaware of what was happening on the surface, making rescue or escape nearly impossible. Number 2. Trench raiders. In World War I, trench raiders were the soldiers tasked with conducting horrifically dangerous raids into enemy trenches. These missions were carried out under the cover of darkness, with the primary objectives of gathering intelligence, capturing prisoners, spreading chaos, and instilling a constant fear in the enemy. Trench raiders were chosen for their courage and ferocity, and were usually volunteers. Raiding parties were small, typically consisting of a few hand-picked men. They were armed with knives, clubs, grenades, and pistols to be as quick and effective as possible. They would wait for the right moment, when there was fog or no moonlight, in the darkest part of the night. They used camouflage to blend into no man's land, and their faces were smeared with coal or mud. First, they would slowly and silently crawl out of their front-line trenches, slip under their own barbed wire, and in complete silence, one after another, begin to crawl towards the enemy side. Every movement had to be deliberate and undetectable to avoid alerting enemy sentries. No man's land was a scarred wasteland, filled with mud, barbed wire, and the decaying remains of fallen soldiers. Occasionally, the enemy would fire flares that lit up the entire field, as if it were day for a few seconds. This was a critical moment when they had to remain absolutely still and blend into the ground. Otherwise, if spotted, the entire front would open fire on them, and the chances of returning were nearly zero. Many raiding parties ended tragically with just one mistake, when they were spotted and trapped in no man's land without any cover. First, They had to cut through the enemy's barbed wire. The next challenge was eliminating the enemy sentry in silence to avoid raising the alarm and losing the element of surprise. After that, they would approach the enemy trench, and the real horror would begin. First, a series of bombs, and immediately after the explosions, the group would rush into the trenches and with terrifying speed attack the shocked enemies. The fighting was almost always hand-to-hand with short, primitive but brutally effective weapons. They had to complete their task quickly, usually capturing prisoners and gathering information. Then, they had to quickly return before enemy reinforcements arrived, now that the entire front knew something was happening. The way back was equally risky and dangerous. They had to navigate all the obstacles, both enemy and their own barbed wire, again. In the chaos and darkness, soldiers could get tangled in the barbed wire, or even lose their orientation and jump into the enemy trench, thinking it was their own. Despite the planning, the outcome was always uncertain. Many raiders never returned, either killed in action or captured by the enemy. Number 3. Wiring parties. Wiring parties in World War I had the crucial task of constructing and repairing barbed wire defenses in no man's land. These missions were essential for trench security, yet they exposed soldiers to extreme danger. Operating primarily at night, wiring parties had to set up or fix the webs of barbed wire. The cover of darkness was their only protection from enemy snipers and machine gunners. Despite the relative concealment, any sound or sudden movement could draw lethal fire. Wiring parties often worked within close proximity of enemy soldiers, who were equally vigilant and ready to shoot at any sign of activity. The soldiers moved quietly, carrying heavy coils of barbed wire, stakes, mallets, and other tools necessary for their task. Everything had to be done silently on the unstable, shattered terrain of no man's land. The mud could be knee-deep, and every step was a struggle. Slipping in the dark could lead to serious injuries, and the noise might bring down a hail of bullets or artillery fire. They had to drive wooden stakes firmly into the ground, which was challenging to do quietly. Later in the war, stakes with a screw-like lower part were used, which could be quietly twisted into the ground without the need for hammering. Wiring operations often took several hours, with soldiers working through the night to complete their tasks before dawn. The relief of returning safely was tempered by the knowledge that they might have to do it all again the next night. Constant shelling meant that trenches and wires had to be continually repaired. Number 4. Stretcher bearers. Stretcher bearers in World War I were tasked with the incredibly dangerous job of retrieving the wounded from the front lines, often under intense enemy fire and the most harrowing conditions. These brave men repeatedly returned to the front lines, dressing wounds and rescuing the injured, all while facing the constant threat of enemy fire. They navigated through mud, shell craters, and barbed wire in the dark, searching for wounded soldiers to save and bring back. Their job was to carry the wounded to regimental aid posts, dressing stations, and sometimes distant casualty clearing stations. They had to maneuver down slopes and shell holes, especially at night. The psychological toll was equally severe. Stretcher bearers had to respond to the cries of the wounded. If they were already carrying a wounded soldier and came upon another one, they would administer pain relief and promise to return. The relentless pressure of the job pushed them above their limits. With little formal medical training, they quickly learned to control bleeding, manage pain, and make critical decisions about the viability of saving a soldier, all while under fire. Despite the brutal conditions, they offered hope and care to soldiers enduring the horrors of the battlefield. By the end of the war, stretcher bearers had not only saved countless lives, but had also revolutionized battlefield medicine. However, during major battles, there were often not enough stretcher bearers to cope with the hundreds of soldiers who might be wounded in a matter of minutes. Carrying a large man wearing full field equipment over muddy ground required at least 4 men per stretcher, and sometimes 6, or even 8, if they needed to go any distance. This meant that soldiers who were wounded often had to make their own way to the aid post, or be assisted by their comrades unless a stretcher became free. During an attack on enemy lines, it was even forbidden to stop and look after a wounded comrade instead of pressing on with the assault. As a result, casualties often had to wait in no man's land for hours until there was time to help them, which in many cases meant not until night fell. Eyewitness accounts of the First World War often mention that one of the worst things to endure was the sound of wounded men lying out between the trenches, screaming, sobbing, or calling for help. The physical toll on stretcher bearers was immense, with many suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, and injuries of their own. They were constantly exposed to the horrors of war, witnessing the aftermath of brutal combat firsthand. Many stretcher bearers were killed or wounded in the line of duty, selflessly giving their life to save others. These are just some of the terrifying but crucial roles of World War I. If you want to learn more about such roles, you can watch the following video where we describe even more of them.